Massive gambling debts are usually paid in cash or lead. But when Sandra racked up $2 million at Bellagio high roller tables, she paid with something else entirely: her own daughter. Bridget wasn't a fragile, trembling prize. She was a 250-pound corporate auditor possessing a steel spine, traded away to a paralyzed syndicate kingpin, expecting a terrified victim. He thought he had just acquired simple collateral. He didn't know he had just brought his absolute queen into his fortress. The neon glare of the Las Vegas Strip always seeped through the cheap blinds of Sandra's apartment, casting a sickly, fluorescent glow over the eviction notices piled on the kitchen counter. Bridget sat at the cramped dining table, her fingers flying across the keys of her laptop. At 28, Bridget was a senior forensic accountant for a mid-sized firm on Wilshire Boulevard, a woman whose life revolved around finding hidden money. She was fiercely proud of her body, a solid, unapologetically fat woman who carried her 250 pounds with the kind of imposing, undeniable presence that demanded space in any room she walked into. She wore sharp, tailored blazers that accentuated her curves, and she never, ever slouched. "Mum, the math isn't mathing," Bridget said, rubbing her temples as she stared at the glowing spreadsheet. "There's a $60,000 withdrawal from your Chase account. Tell me you didn't go back to the Bellagio." Sandra, a frail woman whose face was heavily lined from decades of chain smoking and stress, wouldn't meet her daughter's eyes. She stood by the sink, nervously twisting a damp dish towel. "It was a sure thing, Bridge. I had the inside track on a baccarat shoe. I needed to win back the rest." Before Bridget could unleash the lecture, she had rehearsed 1,000 times. The heavy oak door of the apartment didn't just knock, it shuddered under a massive blow. The deadbolt splintered instantly. 2 men walked in. They were dressed in immaculate charcoal Tom Ford suits that screamed organized, sanitized violence. The taller one, a man with a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow, stepped forward. "Sandra," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Time's up." Sandra collapsed to her knees, sobbing instantly. "Please, Winston, please give me until Friday. I can get a loan against the car." "The 2014 Honda Civic. That won't even cover the interest on the $2 million you owe Mr. Harrison," Winston sneered. He didn't look at Sandra for long. His cold, dead eyes shifted to Bridget, who had already stood up from the table. She didn't cower. She didn't scream. Bridget crossed her arms, her sheer physical presence forcing Winston to take a half step back, recalibrating his assessment of the situation. "Who the hell are you? And who is Mr. Harrison?" Bridget demanded, her voice steady, resonant, and dripping with authority. "I'm the guy collecting a debt, and Mr. Harrison is the man who owns your mother's life," Winston replied, recovering his composure. He pulled a folded document from his breast pocket and tossed it onto the laptop keyboard. "But your mother made a deal, an exchange of assets." Bridget picked up the paper. It was a crude, handwritten contract, notarized by a dirty lawyer, transferring guardianship and employment of Bridget to an offshore holding company. She stared at her mother, who was now weeping into her hands on the linoleum floor. "You sold me," Bridget stated. It wasn't a question. The sheer absurdity of it, the absolute betrayal, bypassed her grief and went straight to a cold, calculating rage. "For gambling debts." "They were going to kill me, Bridget," Sandra wailed. "They said if you worked for them, doing their books, being their collateral, they would clear the ledger. It's just for a few years." Winston gestured to the door. "Grab your coat, sweetheart. Mr. Harrison is waiting in Beverly Hills." Bridget didn't cry. She didn't beg. She calmly closed her laptop, unplugged the charger, and slipped it into her leather tote bag. She walked over to her mother, looking down at the pathetic figure curled on the floor. "You always were a coward, Mum, but you severely underestimated my value." Bridget turned to Winston, her expression entirely unbothered. "Lead the way, Winston. Let's go meet the man who thinks he can buy people." They drove her in a blacked-out Maybach S-Class, weaving through the midnight traffic of Los Angeles until they reached the heavy wrought-iron gates of an estate in the Hollywood Hills. The property was a modern fortress of glass, steel, and concrete, heavily guarded by men carrying suppressed automatic weapons. Bridget took it all in, mentally cataloguing the security cameras, the layout, and the visible wealth. She was an auditor. She lived to dissect systems of power and find their weaknesses. The interior of the mansion was stark, minimalist, and terrifyingly silent. Winston escorted Bridget through a massive foyer adorned with a genuine Rothko painting, leading her into a dimly lit library. The walls were lined with leather-bound books, but the center of the room was dominated by a massive mahogany desk. Behind the desk sat Arthur Harrison. Arthur was the head of the West Coast's most brutal syndicate, a Korean-born mastermind who had been adopted into a prominent Western crime family as a boy. He had clawed his way to the top of the food chain, shedding his past and adopting a fully Western identity to rule his empire. He was strikingly handsome, with sharp, aristocratic features and eyes as cold as absolute zero. But what immediately caught Bridget's attention wasn't his intimidating glare. It was the state-of-the-art titanium wheelchair he was confined to. A rival cartel's car bomb 3 years ago had severed Arthur's spinal cord, leaving him paralyzed from the waist down. Since then, he had ruled with an iron, if physically immobile, fist. He expected weakness. He demanded terror from those brought before him. Arthur looked up from a crystal glass of Macallan 25, his eyes locking onto Bridget. He paused. She wasn't the weeping, fragile girl Sandra had described. Bridget stood tall, her broad shoulders squared, her chin tilted up. Her deep plum blazer and dark trousers made her look like a CEO about to fire an underperforming executive, not a hostage. "You're Bridget," Arthur said, his voice smooth, cultured, but carrying an unmistakable edge of malice. "Your mother priced your life at $2 million. Frankly, looking at you, I'm wondering if I overpaid." It was a deliberate insult, a test to see if she would break. Bridget walked forward, ignoring Winston's warning growl behind her, and pulled out the heavy leather guest chair opposite Arthur's desk. She sat down, crossing one leg over the other, claiming the space as her own. "First of all, Arthur," Bridget began, intentionally omitting any honorifics, "my mother is an idiot who couldn't price a loaf of bread correctly, let alone a human asset. Secondly, if your organization is accepting humans as collateral for casino markers, your liquid capital must be in serious jeopardy. Are you running a syndicate or a pawn shop?" Silence descended on the room, like a physical weight. Winston reached for his firearm, but Arthur raised a single, commanding hand, stopping his lieutenant in his tracks. A slow, dark amusement flickered in Arthur's eyes. "You have a sharp tongue for someone who legally belongs to me," Arthur noted, leaning forward, resting his elbows on the mahogany wood. "I belong to no one," Bridget retorted smoothly. "I'm a senior forensic accountant. I saw the cars outside. I see the Rothko on the wall. You have money. But money isn't power if the IRS or the feds can track it. You brought me here to be collateral, maybe to scare me into compliance. But let's be real. You're paralyzed, Arthur." Winston gasped at the sheer audacity. No one mentioned the boss's condition. It was an unspoken death sentence. Arthur's jaw clenched. his knuckles turning white as he gripped the armrests of his wheelchair. "Tread carefully, Bridget." "I don't tread carefully. I tread heavily," Bridget shot back, leaning in to match his intensity. "You are bound to that chair. That means your lieutenants are doing the legwork. It means they handle the cash, the laundering, the drops. And human nature dictates that when the king is seated, the knights start stealing from the treasury. I guarantee you, Arthur, you are bleeding money from the inside, and you don't even know it." Arthur stared at her, assessing the bold, plus-size woman who had just walked into his stronghold and essentially called him blind to his own organization's treachery. "And I suppose you can find this bleeding," Arthur challenged, his tone dropping an octave. "Give me read-only access to your front company's ledgers for 24 hours, Bridget said, her eyes burning with fierce intelligence. "If I don't find at least $500,000 being skimmed by your own people, you can throw me in whatever dungeon you have in the basement. But when I find it, we renegotiate my mother's debt. I am not collateral. I am a consultant, and my fee is high." Arthur looked at this magnificent, brazen woman. He had spent the last 3 years surrounded by sycophants who pitied him or secretly plotted against him. Bridget was the first person to look him dead in the eye, acknowledge his weakness, and offer him a weapon to fight back. "Winston," Arthur said quietly, never breaking eye contact with Bridget. "Set her up in the East Wing. Give her the laptops. You have 24 hours, Bridget. Do not disappoint me." The East Wing of the estate was luxurious, complete with a king-sized bed, a marble bathroom, and panoramic views of the Los Angeles skyline. But Bridget barely glanced at the amenities. For 18 hours straight, she sat at a heavy glass desk, consuming black coffee and tearing through the digital ledgers of Arthur's legitimate fronts, a chain of laundromats, 3 high-end nightclubs in West Hollywood, and a commercial real estate firm. Bridget was in her element. Where others saw endless rows of numbers, she saw narratives. She saw human greed encoded in mismatched invoices, phantom vendors, and inflated payrolls. Her large fingers danced across the keyboard, cross-referencing shell corporations in Delaware with offshore accounts in the Caymans. By hour 19, she had her target. At 8 a.m., Bridget confidently walked out of her suite. The guards hesitated, unsure if they were supposed to stop her, but her sheer momentum and authoritative scowl made them step aside. She marched straight into the dining room, where Arthur was having a breakfast of black coffee and plain toast, surrounded by 3 of his top capos. One of them was Gregory, a slick, heavily cologned man who ran the nightclub division. Gregory had always resented taking orders from a man in a wheelchair, and his disdain was thinly veiled behind fake smiles. Bridget didn't wait to be announced. She tossed a thick, printed binder onto the table, directly into Arthur's plate, scattering toast crumbs across the pristine white tablecloth. "What the hell is this?" Gregory snapped, standing up to confront her. "Who let the livestock out of her pen?" Bridget didn't even flinch. She stepped right up to Gregory. She was 3 inches taller than him in her bare feet, and her broad, powerful build made him look like a malnourished weasel in a cheap suit. "Sit down, Gregory," Bridget commanded, her voice ringing out with the absolute authority of a judge handing down a sentence. "Before I explain to the boss exactly how you've been using phantom liquor distributors to skim $800,000 from his clubs over the last 14 months. Gregory's face drained of color. You're a liar. Arthur, this fat cow is making things up to save her own skin." Arthur didn't yell. He didn't react immediately. He slowly picked up the binder, opening it to the first page. For 5 agonizing minutes, the room was dead silent, except for the turning of pages. Bridget had highlighted every fake invoice, every routed payment, and even tracked the IP addresses of the shell company's registry directly to a condo Gregory owned in Malibu. It was an airtight, inescapable execution warrant in paper form. Arthur closed the binder. He looked up at Gregory, his eyes devoid of any human warmth. "Winston," Arthur said softly. Winston stepped out of the shadows, a silenced pistol already drawn. Gregory scrambled backward, knocking his chair over. "Arthur, wait, I can explain. It was a reserve fund for the family." Thwip. The silenced shot was deafeningly quiet. Gregory crumpled to the expensive Persian rug, a dark pool of crimson quickly expanding around him. The other two capos froze in absolute terror, their eyes darting from the body to Arthur, and finally to Bridget. Bridget didn't scream. She didn't look away from the dead man on the floor. She had known the consequences of her audit. She had accepted that in this world, numbers equaled blood. She slowly turned her gaze back to Arthur. Arthur wheeled himself back slightly, looking at Bridget with a newfound reverence that bordered on awe. She hadn't just saved him money. She had exposed a cancer in his inner circle that he, in his compromised physical state, had been blind to. She had done it in a day. "The debt is cleared," Arthur said, his voice tight with emotion he was struggling to suppress. "Your mother is free." "I don't care about my mother," Bridget replied coldly, standing tall amidst the smell of cordite and copper. "I care about my terms. You have an empire that is structurally failing because your men think your paralysis makes you stupid. I can fix it. I can make your operation bulletproof, invisible to the IRS, and impossible for your lieutenants to rob. But I am not an employee, Arthur. I am a partner." Arthur looked at the massive, brilliant woman standing before him. She was fearless. She was a titan in a room full of killers. For the first time in his ruthless life, Arthur felt something he hadn't felt since he took over the syndicate. Genuine respect. Slowly, deliberately, Arthur placed his hands on the armrests of his wheelchair. He couldn't stand, but he could show fealty. He leaned his upper body forward, dipping his head deeply toward his chest, holding the position for 3 long seconds. It was a bow. The ruthless, paralyzed king of the West Coast underworld was bowing to the fat, brilliant auditor from Wilshire Boulevard. "Partners then, Bridget," Arthur murmured, looking up at her with a dangerous, intoxicating smirk. "Let's burn this empire down and rebuild it in your image." The execution of Gregory sent a seismic shockwave through Arthur's entire organization. By noon the following day, word had spread from the Hollywood Hills down to the docks of San Pedro. The boss had a new attack dog, and she didn't use bullets. She used spreadsheets. Bridget did not ask for permission to take over the grand executive office on the 2nd floor. She simply walked in, directed Winston to clear out the previous occupant's antique furniture, and had a custom-built, reinforced steel standing desk installed. She replaced the dim, moody Mafia aesthetic with blindingly bright LED panels and a massive 6-monitor array. She wore a tailored, emerald green silk blouse that draped beautifully over her broad frame, paired with sharp black trousers. She looked like a Fortune 500 executive, and she operated with a ruthlessness that made seasoned hitmen avoid her hallway. Arthur gave her complete autonomy. He watched her through the security cameras, utterly fascinated. For 3 years, his paralysis had forced him to rely on the localized vision of his capos, men who constantly assured him that profits were stable while quietly lining their own pockets. Bridget, however, stripped away the pleasantries. She didn't care about their feelings. On her 3rd day, Bridget summoned Richard Caldwell to her office. Richard was a 60-year-old traditionalist who controlled the syndicate's lucrative shipping routes out of the port of Long Beach. He was a man who believed power was measured in physical intimidation and legacy. He despised the fact that he, a 30-year veteran of the underworld, was being audited by a 28-year-old woman who looked like she belonged in a suburban corporate HR department. When Richard entered Bridget's office, he didn't sit in the standard guest chair. He paced, attempting to fill the room with his presence, chewing on an unlit cigar. "I don't know what kind of spell you've cast on Arthur, sweetheart," Richard said, his tone dripping with condescension as he eyed her 250-pound frame with blatant disgust. "But the docks are a different beast. You don't know the unions, you don't know the harbor patrols, and you sure as hell don't know how to read a maritime manifest. So whatever you think you're going to find, you can save yourself the calories and stop looking." Bridget didn't look up from her center monitor. Her fingers continued their rhythmic, aggressive typing. "Are you finished, Richard?" she asked, her voice dangerously calm. "I'm just getting started. I brought you the quarterly ledgers," he sneered, tossing a flash drive onto her desk. "Clean as a whistle, just like always." Bridget finally stopped typing. She slowly turned her chair, pinning Richard with a stare so icy it made the veteran mobster involuntarily pause. She picked up the flash drive, held it between her thumb and index finger, and casually dropped it into her trash can. "I don't need your sanitized, fabricated garbage, Richard," Bridget stated, standing up. At 5'10", in 3-inch heels, her physical presence was a mountain of unyielding authority. She stepped out from behind the desk, walking deliberately toward him. "I already pulled the raw data from the Long Beach Port Authority's automated terminal system. I cross-referenced the container weights with your reported cargo manifests." Richard's confident smirk faltered. You hacked the Port Authority." "I didn't hack anything. I paid a mid-level IT administrator 50 grand from Gregory's recovered slush fund to give me an API key," Bridget corrected smoothly. She tapped a key on her keyboard, and all 6 monitors behind her illuminated with red-flagged data streams. "You've been underreporting the weight of shipping containers coming in from Macau. The manifests say you're importing textiles, but the tonnage implies heavy machinery, or more likely, untaxed bullion and raw precursor chemicals. You're running a side business on Arthur's ships, using his fuel, his bribes, and his men." Richard took a step back, his face flushing crimson. "Listen here, you fat. I suggest you choose your next words with absolute precision." Arthur's voice echoed from the doorway. Richard whipped around. Arthur sat in his titanium wheelchair in the threshold, Winston standing stoically behind him. Arthur's face was an emotionless mask, but the terrifying intensity in his dark eyes made the temperature in the room plummet. "Arthur, she's overstepping," Richard pleaded, panic raising the pitch of his voice. "I built the port division. I've been loyal for 3 decades. You're going to let this outsider, this accountant, dismantle your oldest alliances." Arthur rolled himself further into the room. The quiet, mechanical hum of his chair was the only sound. He stopped beside Bridget, looking up at her, then back to Richard. "My oldest alliances," Arthur began, his voice a lethal whisper, "seem to operate under the delusion that my severed spine has affected my brain. Bridget is not dismantling my empire, Richard. She is fortifying it. She has found more rat holes in my ship in 3 days than you have built in 30 years. Bridget crossed her arms, standing shoulder to shoulder with Arthur's wheelchair. The visual contrast was striking. The physically immobilized, lethally calculating king, and the towering, intellectually devastating queen. "The offshore accounts in Luxembourg," Bridget interjected, her voice cutting through the tension like a scalpel. "I found them, Richard. The shell company is registered to your sister-in-law. You've skimmed roughly $2.4 million over the past 3 years. The exact amount of time Arthur has been in that chair. Richard's knees buckled slightly. He knew the protocol. He had seen Gregory's body dragged out in a rug just days prior. "Arthur, please, the medical bills for my wife." "Stop," Arthur commanded. He didn't want to hear the excuses. He looked at Bridget. "What is your recommendation, partner?" The word partner hung heavily in the air. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a term of endearment. It was an official transfer of power. Bridget looked down at Richard, feeling no pity for a man who had tried to belittle her merely minutes ago. "Killing him is a waste of a network," she analyzed coldly. "We freeze the Luxembourg accounts immediately. We transfer the deeds of his 3 properties in Bel Air to your holding company. Richard stays on as the face of the port division because the union bosses trust him, but his salary is garnished by 80% until the $2.4 million is repaid with interest. If he tries to run, or if a single container goes missing, Winston will visit him, and we won't need a rug," Arthur finished, a cruel smile touching his lips. He looked at Richard. "You belong to her now. If she tells you to jump, you calculate the trajectory and ask for permission to land. Get out of my sight." Richard practically tripped over himself fleeing the room. When the door clicked shut, the heavy tension dissipated, leaving a strange, charged silence between Bridget and Arthur. Winston had quietly slipped out behind Richard, knowing better than to intrude on the new dynamic. Arthur looked up at Bridget, studying the way the harsh office light caught the determined set of her jaw. She was breathing heavily, the adrenaline of the confrontation finally catching up to her. "You didn't have to spare him," Arthur noted quietly. "Most people in this life would have taken the kill to establish dominance." "I establish dominance through efficiency, not body counts," Bridget replied, walking over to pour 2 glasses of bourbon from a crystal decanter on a side table. She handed one to Arthur. "Dead men can't pay you back. A terrified, indebted man, however, will work 20-hour days to keep his life. It's basic economics." Arthur took the glass, his fingers brushing against hers. A spark, undeniable and electric, passed between them. He didn't pull away. "When I woke up in the hospital 3 years ago, and the doctors told me my legs were gone, I thought my empire was over," Arthur confessed, his voice dropping its menacing edge, revealing a rare vulnerability. "In this world, if you can't stand tall, you are prey. I spent every day waiting for the knife in my back. I hired muscle. I built walls, but I was always bleeding out from 1,000 tiny cuts." Bridget looked at him, truly seeing him. Not as the ruthless kingpin, but as a brilliant, isolated man fighting desperately against his own physical limitations. She sat on the edge of her desk, bringing herself closer to his eye level. "You aren't prey, Arthur," Bridget said softly, her dark eyes locking onto his. "You just had the wrong architects building your fortress. They built you walls of stone. I'm building you a fortress of data. And data doesn't care if you can walk." Arthur smiled, a genuine, breathtaking smile that transformed his sharp, aristocratic face. "I bought collateral. I ended up with a conqueror." The honeymoon period of Bridget's new financial regime lasted exactly 3 weeks. In that time, she revolutionized the syndicate. Bridget's protocols, decentralized laundering. Cash from the street was no longer dumped into single-front businesses. It was micro-layered through hundreds of automated digital transactions, utilizing crypto tumblers and high-frequency trading algorithms. Biometric redundancy. No capo could authorize a transfer over $10,000 without dual-factor biometric approval, monitored directly from Bridget's terminal. The weight tax, a mandatory 5% levy on all illicit operations, funneled directly into a blind trust solely accessible by Arthur and Bridget. The syndicate was richer and more secure than it had ever been, But absolute security creates absolute jealousy in rival factions. Victor Sullivan was a third-generation Irish mobster who controlled the illegal gambling and extortion rackets in the San Fernando Valley. He was a brute, a man who lacked Arthur's finesse, but made up for it with sheer, unpredictable violence. Sullivan had noticed the sudden tightening of Arthur's operations. His own informants within Arthur's ranks had gone silent, terrified of Bridget's forensic tracking. Sullivan realized that if he didn't strike now, Arthur's modernized syndicate would eventually swallow Los Angeles whole. The attack didn't come in the form of a drive-by shooting. It came as a digital siege. It was a Tuesday afternoon. Bridget was off-site, conducting a physical audit at 1 Wilshire, the towering, windowless skyscraper in downtown Los Angeles that served as the premier data center for the West Coast. She needed to personally secure a new line of encrypted servers. She was accompanied by Winston and 2 other heavily armed guards. As Bridget was deep in the server racks on the 4th floor, her tablet screen suddenly flashed red. A massive DDoS attack was hammering their primary financial gateway, attempting to brute force the decryption keys to the blind trust. "Someone is hitting the mainframe," Bridget muttered, her fingers flying across the touch screen, initiating lockdown protocols. "It's a distraction. They're trying to flood the network so they can slip a Trojan into the payroll system." "Can you stop it from here?" Winston asked, constantly scanning the narrow aisles of blinking server towers. "I can, but I need 10 minutes to reroute the subnets," Bridget said, not looking up. Suddenly, the heavy steel doors to the server floor blew open with a deafening crash. The screech of tortured metal echoed through the freezing, air-conditioned room. 4 men dressed in tactical black gear, carrying suppressed compact submachine guns, poured into the room. This wasn't just a cyber attack. It was an assassination attempt. Sullivan knew that taking out the financial architect would cripple Arthur's newly reinforced empire. "Contact!" Winston roared, shoving Bridget hard behind a massive row of server cabinets, just as a hail of bullets shredded the drywall where she had been standing. Winston and the 2 guards returned fire, the confined space turning into a deafening echo chamber of gunfire and shattering plastic. Bridget hit the cold, raised floor hard. Her breath caught in her throat, but panic didn't paralyze her. Her brain immediately switched into crisis management mode. She crawled backward, her large frame making it difficult to squeeze between the narrow maintenance gaps, but she pushed through with sheer adrenaline. One of Arthur's guards took a round to the shoulder and went down, screaming. The attackers were advancing methodically, pinning Winston down. Bridget looked at her tablet. She was locked out of the financial mainframe until the DDoS attack subsided, but she was still connected to the local 1 Wilshire Building Management API, an access point she had bribed an engineer for an hour ago to bypass security checkpoints. She opened the build-in schematic. She was in server room 4B. What is the ultimate fear in a data center? She thought rapidly. Fire. If a fire is detected, water isn't used. It would destroy billions in hardware. Instead, they use halon gas or modern inert gas systems to instantly suck the oxygen out of the room, suffocating the fire. And anyone inside. "Winston!" Bridget screamed over the gunfire. "Get to the airlock door, now!" Winston didn't question her. He grabbed the wounded guard by the vest and laid down a blinding blanket of covering fire, dragging him toward the reinforced glass exit at the far end of the hall. Bridget bypassed the standard safety protocols on her tablet. She found the environmental controls for room 4B, override code, Alpha 7. Tango. She executed the command. Instantly, the blaring, high-pitched shriek of the fire alarm cut through the gunfire. Flashing strobe lights turned the server room into a chaotic disco of red and white. From the ceiling, heavy mechanical vents slammed shut, sealing the room. A loud hiss echoed as the inert gas deployment sequence began. The attackers stopped firing, looking up in confusion as a thick white fog began pouring from the ceiling nozzles. Bridget didn't wait to watch. She scrambled to her feet, her heels abandoned on the floor, and sprinted with surprising speed for a woman of her size toward the airlock. She threw her heavy shoulder against the heavy glass door just as Winston reached it. They hauled the wounded guard into the sterile anteroom and slammed the door shut, locking the deadbolt. Through the thick glass, Bridget watched coldly as Sullivan's hit squad began to panic. The inert gas was designed to drop oxygen levels below 15%, enough to kill a fire, and if someone didn't have an oxygen mask, enough to render them unconscious in seconds, followed swiftly by asphyxiation. The men clawed at their throats, dropping their weapons, staggering blindly through the server aisles. Within 45 seconds, all 4 men were on the floor, unmoving. Bridget stood leaning against the glass, her emerald blouse torn at the shoulder, her chest heaving, but her eyes burning with an unholy fire. She had just killed 4 men with a tablet. Winston stared at her, his usual stoic demeanor entirely shattered. He had protected Arthur for a decade, but he had never seen a civilian execute a tactical wipeout with a software command. "Jesus Christ, Bridget," Winston breathed. "Call the cleanup crew," Bridget ordered, her voice trembling slightly with post-adrenaline shock, but holding firm. "And get me back to Arthur. Sullivan just declared war." The ride back to the Hollywood Hills was a blur. When Bridget finally walked into the library, she was barefoot, disheveled and covered in server rack dust. Arthur was waiting. When he saw her state, his face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated fury. He didn't look at Winston. He didn't ask for a sit-rep. He wheeled his chair forward, so violently he nearly tipped it, closing the distance between him and Bridget in a second. He reached out, his hands trembling, not from weakness, but from the terrifying realization of how close he had come to losing her. He gripped her waist, pulling her solid, imposing frame against the side of his chair. "You're bleeding," Arthur rasped, looking at a shallow graze on her arm from a piece of shrapnel. "It's nothing," Bridget said, finally letting her guard drop, her hands resting naturally on his broad shoulders. "Sullivan tried to hit the mainframe and me at the same time. I handled the hitmen. The network held." Arthur looked up at her, the cold, calculating Mafia boss entirely stripped away, leaving only a fiercely protective man. His eyes swept over her face, taking in her resilience, her brilliance, her absolute refusal to be a victim. "I cannot lose you," Arthur said, the words slipping out with a raw, desperate honesty. "I survived the bomb. I survived the betrayal. But if I lose my queen, the game is over." He reached up, his hand gently cupping her jaw, his thumb brushing a smudge of dirt from her cheek. For the first time, Bridget didn't feel like the imposing auditor who had to fight for every ounce of respect. She felt revered. She felt essential. "You aren't going to lose me, Arthur," Bridget whispered, leaning down slightly, closing the space between them until their foreheads rested against each other. "But Sullivan is going to lose everything." Arthur's eyes darkened with a lethal, intoxicating promise. "He will beg for the bullet when we are done with him. Tell me what you need, partner." Bridget pulled back, a dangerous smile spreading across her lips. "I need all of Sullivan's offshore routing numbers. I'm going to drain his empire to 0 by midnight, and then we are going to buy his lieutenants with his own money." Arthur let out a low, dark laugh. The king and queen were aligned, and the West Coast underworld was about to burn. The atmosphere in Arthur's executive library was thick with the scent of ozone from overworked servers and the rich, peaty aroma of Lagavulin 16-year-old Scotch. It was 2 a.m. Bridget had not slept, nor had she slowed down. She sat at the center of her 6-monitor array, bathed in the harsh blue light of scrolling data streams, her eyes darting across ledgers, wire transfers, and encrypted routing protocols. Victor Sullivan was a brute, but he wasn't entirely stupid. He didn't keep his millions in duffel bags under a mattress. He utilized a sophisticated web of offshore accounts, primarily routed through the Cayman National Bank, and a series of anonymous shell corporations headquartered in the British Virgin Islands. But Sullivan's fatal flaw was human error. He liked to mix business with pleasure. "I have him," Bridget announced, her voice a low, triumphant rasp that cut through the silence of the room. Arthur, who had been sitting quietly in his wheelchair near the window, watching the city lights of Los Angeles, immediately rolled toward her desk. Winston stood at attention by the door, his eyes locked on the screens he barely understood, but deeply respected. "Explain it to me," Arthur said, his tone laced with a dangerous anticipation. Bridget tapped her polished fingernail against the center monitor. "Sullivan uses a decentralized crypto exchange to clean the cash from his San Fernando extortion rackets. But he has a weakness. He bought a $2 million commercial property on Rodeo Drive under an LLC named Shamrock Holdings. The tenant is a high-end luxury boutique owned by a woman named Chloe Jenkins." Arthur raised a brow. "His mistress?" "Exactly," Bridget confirmed, a ruthless smirk playing on her lips. "Chloe is Sullivan's off-the-books liability. Sullivan pays the property taxes, the inventory overhead, and her massive American Express Platinum bills using an automated clearinghouse transfer from a dummy account at Credit Suisse. But the idiot linked that Credit Suisse account to his primary authentication node for the Cayman deposits." Bridget began typing furiously, the mechanical clatter of her keyboard echoing like a drum line marching to war. "We can't just hack the Cayman National Bank. Their encrypted firewalls are military grade," Bridget explained, her fingers flying. "But I don't need to break down the front door. I just need to steal the key from the idiot who left it under the welcome mat. I'm initiating a targeted freeze on Chloe Jenkins' merchant accounts, flagging her boutique for massive synthetic fraud violations through the Visa and MasterCard merchant portals." Arthur watched in awe as the screens shifted. "What does that do?" "It causes a panic," Bridget said coldly. "Chloe is going to wake up in about 10 seconds to automated alerts that her accounts are frozen, her inventory is flagged for seizure, and her credit lines are dead. She's going to do exactly what a panicked mistress does. She's going to call her sugar daddy." Right on cue, a line of code on Bridget's right monitor spiked in red. "There's the call," Bridget whispered. "Sullivan is answering. He's logging into his mobile banking portal to wire her emergency funds to stop the asset seizure. And in doing so, he just pinged the authentication server with his master password." Winston leaned forward, completely captivated by the bloodless assassination happening before his eyes. "I have the token," Bridget announced. She hit the enter key with a resounding clack. "We are inside the Cayman mainframe, accessing the Shamrock Holdings umbrella accounts." On the main screen, a number appeared. $42,850,900. It was the entirety of Victor Sullivan's liquid empire, built on decades of blood, extortion, and violence. "Drain it," Arthur commanded softly. "Every last cent. We can't just send it to your accounts. That triggers Interpol," Bridget corrected, her analytical mind staying entirely objective. "We distribute it. We weaponize it." She quickly pulled up a separate, heavily encrypted file containing the private banking details of Sullivan's top 5 lieutenants. Winston had spent the last 3 hours violently interrogating a mid-level Sullivan associate to acquire these specific routing numbers. "Winston," Bridget said, not taking her eyes off the screen. "Get Liam O'Connor on the phone. Now." Liam O'Connor was Sullivan's right-hand man, the brutal enforcer who actually commanded the street soldiers. Within 2 minutes, Winston had the bleary-eyed, angry mobster on an encrypted line, placing the phone on speaker on Bridget's desk. "Who the hell is this?" Liam snarled over the line. "Do you know what time it is?" "Liam, this is Bridget. I'm Arthur Harrison's partner," she said, her voice dripping with absolute, terrifying authority. "I suggest you open your personal Wells Fargo offshore banking app immediately." There was a pause, followed by the rustling of sheets and heavy breathing. "What kind of sick game are you playing, Harrison?" "It's not a game, Liam," Arthur spoke up, his voice smooth and deadly. "Look at your balance." A long silence stretched over the speakerphone, broken only by a sharp, sudden gasp from the Irish enforcer. Where did $3 million come from?" Liam stammered, all the bravado completely stripped from his voice. "It came from Victor Sullivan's retirement fund," Bridget answered. "Right now, your boss has exactly $0 and 0 cents to his name. His Cayman accounts are empty. His shell companies are bankrupt. The properties in Nevada are currently being transferred to our holding firm via a forced digital liquidation." You wiped him out?" Liam whispered in disbelief. "I didn't just wipe him out. I bought his army," Bridget stated, standing up, her imposing figure casting a long shadow across the office. "The other 4 capos just received $2 million each. Victor Sullivan is a dead man walking, Liam. He just doesn't know it yet. At 8 a.m., Sullivan is going to realize he's broke, and he is going to rally you and his men to storm this estate in a blind panic." "And what do you want me to do?" Liam asked. He was a mercenary at heart. Loyalty in the underworld only lasted as long as the cash flow, and Bridget had just proven she controlled the ocean, not just the stream. "I want you to let him," Bridget commanded. "Bring him to my front door, and when he steps inside, you will show him exactly who pays your salary now." Bridget reached over and disconnected the call. She looked at the center monitor. Sullivan's balance read $0. She turned to Arthur, running a hand through her hair, a ferocious, exhausted smile lighting up her face. "The audit is complete, Arthur. Sullivan is insolvent." Arthur didn't smile. He stared at her with a look of absolute reverence, a deep, burning intensity that made the air in the room feel incredibly thin. He slowly wheeled himself forward until his knees bumped against her legs. He looked up at this magnificent, heavy-set woman who had walked into his life as a sacrificial lamb and transformed into the most lethal predator in Los Angeles. "I have spent my entire life building power with fear and bullets," Arthur murmured, his hands reaching out to gently grasp her waist. "And you dismantled my greatest enemy without leaving this room." "Fear is temporary, Arthur," Bridget whispered, her hands resting naturally on his broad chest, feeling the heavy, steady rhythm of his heart. "Bankruptcy is forever." The Los Angeles morning sun was blindingly bright, casting a golden hue over the Hollywood Hills. At exactly 8:45 a.m., a convoy of 4 black Escalades tore through the reinforced iron gates of Arthur's estate. Victor Sullivan burst out of the lead vehicle before it even came to a complete stop. He was red-faced, sweating profusely, and gripping a heavy tactical shotgun. He was a man who had woken up to find his entire life's work erased by a ghost in a machine. He was operating on pure, unadulterated rage. Behind him, Liam O'Connor and 10 heavily armed soldiers piled out of the vehicles. "Harrison!" Sullivan roared, marching up the sweeping stone steps toward the mansion's double oak doors. "I'm going to mount your head on my wall." The doors swung open, but it wasn't Arthur's armed guards who stood in the threshold. It was Bridget. She wore a sharply tailored crimson pantsuit that accentuated her 250-pound frame, making her look like a monolith of absolute power. She stood tall, her hands casually clasped in front of her, entirely unbothered by the tactical shotgun pointed directly at her chest. Behind her, Arthur sat calmly in his wheelchair, Winston at his shoulder. "You," Sullivan snarled, his eyes bulging. "You're the fat bitch who hacked my accounts. I'm going to blow you in half, and then I'm going to roll this cripple off his own balcony." Bridget didn't flinch. She looked down at Sullivan with an expression of mild disgust, like a CEO examining a cockroach on the boardroom table. "Victor," Bridget said, her voice echoing across the courtyard with terrifying calmness. "Your accounts weren't hacked. They were audited. I simply foreclosed on an underperforming asset. You." Sullivan racked the shotgun, taking a step forward. "I have 12 men behind me, sweetheart. Your little computer tricks don't mean a damn thing when I paint this marble floor with your brains. Liam, take the guards." Silence. Sullivan blinked, the heavy, deafening absence of movement confusing his rage-addled brain. He turned his head slightly. "Liam, I said take the damn guards." "Sorry, boss," Liam said softly. Sullivan felt the cold, hard steel of a .45 caliber pistol pressed directly into the base of his skull. He froze. Slowly, agonizingly, he turned to see Liam holding the gun, his face completely devoid of emotion. Behind Liam, the other 10 soldiers had lowered their weapons, their barrels pointed toward the ground, their stances relaxed. They weren't here to fight. They were here to deliver a package. What is this?" Sullivan stammered, the shotgun trembling in his suddenly weak hands. "Liam, I made you. I brought you up from the gutters of Southie." "You did, Victor," Liam agreed. "But you pay me in cash that bounces. The lady in the red suit pays via encrypted offshore wire, and her check's clear." Bridget walked slowly down the stone steps. The click of her heels against the marble was the only sound in the courtyard. She stopped 3 feet from Sullivan, her sheer physical presence forcing the ruined mobster to shrink backward. "I told you, Victor," Bridget said, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "You are insolvent. You have no money. You have no army. You have no leverage. In the business world, this is what we call a hostile takeover." She reached out and casually, effortlessly, pulled the shotgun from Sullivan's limp grip. She handed it to Winston, who had stepped up beside her. "Arthur," Bridget called out without turning around. "What is the penalty for trespassing on our property with a firearm?" Arthur rolled his chair forward to the edge of the threshold. He looked at Sullivan, not with anger, but with absolute pity. "Winston," Arthur said calmly, "take Mr. Sullivan to the soundproof basement. Have a long conversation with him about his behavior. Liam, you and your men can report to the Eastern Warehouse District for your new security rotations. Your new boss has a strict payroll schedule. Do not be late." "Yes, Mr. Harrison," Liam said respectfully. 2 of the soldiers grabbed the sobbing, hyperventilating Sullivan by the arms, dragging him out of the bright morning sun and into the dark depths of the estate. Within minutes, the courtyard was entirely empty, save for the idling escalades. Bridget stood in the sunlight, taking a deep breath of the crisp morning air. She had done it. She had completely restructured the power dynamics of the West Coast underworld in less than a month, without ever firing a bullet herself. She turned and walked back up the steps, stopping in front of Arthur's wheelchair. The paralyzed kingpin looked up at her. The vulnerability and awe she had seen the night before had solidified into something permanent, something unbreakable. "They won't ever look at me as the crippled boss again, will they?" Arthur asked softly. No, Bridget replied, reaching down to trace the sharp line of his jaw. They will look at you as the man smart enough to let the Queen take the board. Arthur grabbed her hand, pulling her down slightly. He didn't care about his physical limitations anymore. He didn't care about the men who had betrayed him. He only cared about the magnificent, brilliant, imposing woman who had rebuilt his empire from the ground up. You sold your life to me to save your mother, Arthur said, his voice thick with raw emotion. I release you, Bridget. The debt is paid 10 times over. You are free to walk out those gates and go back to Wilshire Boulevard. Bridget let out a low, musical laugh. She leaned in, her lips hovering mere inches from his, the magnetic pull between them absolutely undeniable. I'm a senior forensic accountant, Arthur, Bridget whispered against his mouth, her dark eyes flashing with dangerous ambition. I never walk away from an appreciating asset, and right now we are the most valuable asset in this city. I'm not going anywhere. Arthur smiled, pulling her into a fierce, consuming kiss that tasted of scotch, victory, and absolute power. The paralyzed Mafia king and his plus-size queen had taken their throne. And God help anyone who tried to audit them. If you loved witnessing Bridget completely dismantle the underworld with nothing but a laptop and sheer confidence, you absolutely have to hit that like button right now. Share this story with anyone who loves a brilliant, unapologetic female lead who refuses to play by the rules. What was your favorite moment? The server room trap or the hostile takeover of Sullivan's army? Let me know down in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell so you never miss a twisted, heart-pounding Mafia drama. We post thrilling new stories every week, and you won't want to miss what we have coming next.